Sometimes in life you might get asked a question along the lines of, Alex, would you like to borrow a vintage Keytar? And the answer to that sort of question is, Julian, clear my schedule and fetch me my disco glasses. So the Keytar, or the keyboard, if you will, is in equal parts intriguing and silly. Kind of like this channel, actually. And the origins are a little bit subjective. You could argue it's acoustic instruments like the Orphica or even the accordion, but I would argue it's things like the Weltmeister Basset or the Tubon from the 1960s. Something significant that happened in the early 70s was that Edgar Winter modified the keyboard from his ARP 2600 with a guitar strap and an extended cable so that he could groove around thusly. And whilst the sound was still coming from the synth way back yonder, he had the keys and he had the performance controls, so as a concept, it worked. And he wasn't the only one. George Duke did this, as did Roger Powell with a custom-made unit called the Powell Probe, which for all intents and purposes was a Keytar. And so companies thought, why don't we start making these things? And the earliest example of a factory-made Keytar appears to be the Hillwood Rocky board made in Japan in 1977. Shortly after came the Davis Clavitar, which again was a controller and again was used by George Duke. And then a really interesting moment. In 1978, a British company called KMI developed an instrument that they called the Keytar. It appears that they came up with that name. Other companies were calling it Portable Performance Instrument or something of that nature, and their unit was used by Rick Wakeman. 1979, we get the first self-contained synthesizer, which was also a Keytar, which is the Syntar, made by George Mattson. And then in 1980, Moog thought, why don't we make one of these things? So they did. So the Liberation, so named because one is liberated from one's keyboard stand and one can strutteth one's stuffeth. Now, the origin of this instrument is a little bit muddled and confusing, and a huge thank you to Mark Doty at Automatic Gainsay for actually giving me the answer to this. You would be forgiven for thinking it's a Moog Rogue that's been modified and put into a Keytar case. It's not. The Rogue came later and is something else. This actually came from an instrument called the SSK, which Moog never released or finished, and we only know about it because the Bob Moog Foundation has the schematics for it. Also, the Moog Prodigy shares circuitry with the Moog Liberation, so presumably that was also developed from the SSK as well. And by the way, there is a keyboardless expander module version of the Prodigy. A prototype still exists. I've seen it in the flesh. I took these photos, and it is not a custom job, it's a factory-made unit, so the plot thickens. So you start with this rack mount unit and you can't use the Liberation without it. One, it provides the power to the Liberation, but two, it's also where the audio comes out. And interestingly, there is a little interface on here with CV and trigger output so you can play other synthesizers from the Liberation. The synth itself is a very simple 2-oscillator monosynth with sync, noise, and rig modulation. there's your classic Moog ladder filter, an amp, a couple of envelopes and some basic modulation. But there is a little trick up its sleeve. At the end of the mixer section, there is a slider called Poly. And sure enough, there is a very primitive polysynth built into the Liberation. It runs through the one filter and is affected by the envelope generators, so it's a paraphonic articulative affair, but it's better than nothing. So what happens if you turn up the oscillators, which are monophonic, and the poly section at the same time? Well, there is a high note priority, so you can play chords with the poly section and then play a melody over the top. It's really clunky, and you can hear that high note priority causes the oscillators to jump around all over the place, but it gave you something to play with. Okay, now the unusual bit, the neck. So we've got 3 mod wheels. Firstly, volume, self-explanatory. Then we've got a filter cutoff, which is the only one which springs back to a 0 position. Then if we set something to wheel, we've got a mod wheel. Then we've got the pitch ribbon straight off the Poly Moog and the Micro Moog and the Multi Moog, which works with the oscillators but not the Poly section. We've got a glide on and off, which has a slider here. Pretty obvious. And then we've got a section called Force, which disappointingly has nothing to do with Star Wars. So this is actually aftertouch. So if we set the oscillator to Force, for example, and then use the aftertouch loop, we can apply modulation with aftertouch, or we can bend. So then, if you're talented and clever, you can put that all together into an interesting performance. Unfortunately, I'm not talented, neither am I clever, so I'll do something pretty terrible. Jean-Michel Jarre, eat your heart out. In fact, speaking of Jean-Michel Jarre, he is one of the famous users of the Liberation, and even had a feature in his live set where he would bring it to the front of the stage and let rip. And the Liberation was a moderate success. It was used by quite a lot of big names, including James Brown, which is fantastic. Papa's got a brand new synth. And of course, into the 80s, Keytars took off and were everywhere, and you can still buy brand new Keytars to this very day. So there we go, the Moog Liberation, a curious creation making sounds throughout the nation. If you like the sound of the Moog Liberation, I've made a couple of contact patches. As ever, that's available on the top tier of my Patreon. Huge thank you to my patrons for their ongoing support. Thank you to you for watching, and thank you to the owner of this rather charismatic instrument. Cheers.